Picture this. You're a Nazi soldier on the Eastern Front. You're dug into your trench, thinking you're safe. Then suddenly, the guy next to you drops dead. Clean shot through the head, no sound, no warning, just gone. The next day, 2 more of your friends disappear the same way. By the end of the week, you've lost count. Your officers are panicking because nobody can find the shooter. Nobody even knows where the bullets are coming from. And here, ask the thing that would absolutely terrify you if you knew the truth. The person systematically picking off your entire unit, one by one, is a 25-year-old woman who looks like she should be teaching at a university, not hunting. Men through a war zone. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and by the time she was done, she had 309 confirmed kills. That's not propaganda numbers, not estimations minus 309 confirmed, documented eliminations that made her the most lethal female sniper in human history. But what makes her story absolutely insane isn't just the body count, it's everything else. Because this wasn't some backwoods survivalist who grew up hunting. This was a Strata history student who had to fight her way into combat because the Soviet military didn't even want to give her a rifle at first. Now, before we dive into how a bookish young woman became death personified on the battlefield, I need you to understand something about the Eastern Front that Hollywood never quite gets right. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, it wasn't just another military campaign. Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion in human history, 4 million Axis troops pouring across the border with one goal: total annihilation. Hitler wanted the Soviet people either dead or enslaved. There was no middle ground. This wasn't a war with rules. This was extermination. And that the world Lyudmila Pavlichenko walked into when she volunteered in 1941, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to 1916, to a small town called Bila Tserkva in what's now Ukraine, where our story actually begins. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko was born into pretty ordinary circumstances. Her father Mikhail worked in a factory. Nothing fancy, nothing that would suggest their daughter would end up with a rifle in her hands, making history. When she was 14, her family moved to Kyiv, and this is where things start getting interesting, though not in the way you'd expect. Young Lyudmila was competitive, like intensely competitive, the kind of kid who couldn't stand losing at anything. One of her friends, a boy in the neighborhood, was taking shooting lessons at a local club. He wouldn't shut up about how good he was getting, so naturally, Lyudmila's response was basically, "Oh yeah? Watch this." She signed up for the same shooting club, and apparently she had a gift. By the time she was 15, she wasn't just good, she was winning competitions. The girl had a natural steadiness, incredible vision, and most importantly, she could control her breathing and heart rate in ways that turned out to be absolutely perfect for marksmanship. But here's what makes her different from the typical war hero origin story. Lyudmila didn't abandon education to become some kind of warrior. She kept studying. She enrolled at Kyiv University in 1937, pursuing a master's degree in history. By day, she was buried in books about past wars and ancient battles. By night, and on weekends, she was at the shooting range, getting better and better with a rifle. She even got married during this time, and had a son. She was living a completely normal Soviet life: university student, young mother, amateur sharpshooter. That was supposed to be her story. History professor who was really good at shooting on the weekends. Then June 22, 1941 happened. Germany invaded, and everything changed overnight. Lyudmila was 24 years old, in the middle of her studies, and she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She went to the recruiting office to volunteer, and this is where her story could have ended before it even started. The recruiter took one look at her and basically laughed. They tried to shuffle her off to become a nurse, because in their minds, that's where women belonged in wartime, bandaging wounds, not causing them. But Lyudmila wasn't having it. She told them about her marksmanship, her competition wins, her training. They didn't believe her, so she offered to prove it right then and there. They gave her a rifle, probably expecting her to embarrass herself. She didn't. The details vary depending on who's telling the story, but the result was the same. She shot well enough that they had to take her seriously. But they still didn't want to send her to the front lines. Not really. The Soviet military in 1941, despite all its propaganda about equality, wasn't exactly rushing to put women in combat roles. Lyudmila had to fight tooth and nail just to get the chance to fight. Getting into combat was one thing. Surviving it was something else entirely. When Ludmila finally got her wish and was assigned to the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division, she found herself shipped directly to one of the worst places on the entire Eastern Front, Odessa. If you don't know your World War II geography, Odessa was a crucial Soviet port city on the Black Sea, and the Germans wanted it badly. Romanian and German forces were already besieging the city when Ludmila arrived in August 1941, and the fighting was absolutely brutal. Now, here's something they don't show you in the movies. Your first kill as a soldier isn't this dramatic slow-motion moment where time stops and you have some profound realization about mortality. For Ludmila, it was terrifying and confusing, and she almost didn't do it. She spotted 2 Romanian soldiers through her scope on her first day in combat. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was hammering. She'd shot targets 1,000 times, but targets don't shoot back. Targets don't have families. She hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, those 2 soldiers could have killed who knows how many of her comrades. A more experienced soldier was spotting for her, and he basically told her that if she didn't take the shot, someone else was going to die because of her freeze-up. That snapped her out of it. She fired twice. Both soldiers dropped. And just like that, Ludmila Pavlichenko was no longer a student playing soldier. She was a combat sniper with blood on her hands. She later admitted that first kill haunted her, that she felt physically sick afterward. But she also knew there was no going back. This was war. Hesitation meant death. Maybe not hers, but definitely someone's. What happened next is where Ludmila proved she wasn't just some lucky shot. The siege of Odessa lasted 2.5 months, from August to October 1941, and it was absolute hell. The Axis forces outnumbered the Soviet defenders. They had better supply lines, and they were constantly pushing to break through. Every day was chaos: artillery, bombardments, firefights, close quarters, combat in the ruins of what used to be a beautiful coastal city. And somewhere in all that chaos, Ludmila was racking up kills at a rate that started getting attention. By the time the Soviets were forced to evacuate Odessa in October, after 2 months of fighting, Ludmila had 187 confirmed kills. Let me say that again because the number is genuinely hard to process. In roughly 60 days of combat, she had killed 187 enemy soldiers. That's more than 3 confirmed kills per day, every single day, for 2 months straight. And remember, these aren't just any kills. These are confirmed sniper eliminations, meaning every single one was witnessed, verified, and documented. The actual number was probably higher, but 187 is what made it into the official record. Think about what that means practically. Ludmila wasn't sitting in some comfortable position in the rear, taking potshots at distant targets. She was in the absolute thick of the fighting, moving from position to position, sometimes spending 16 hours a day in a concealed spot waiting for targets, eating cold rations, barely sleeping, and doing this day after day while artillery exploded around her and machine gun fire raked her positions. Most soldiers would have broken mentally under those conditions. Ludmila thrived. The Germans and Romanians started to figure out they had a serious problem. Reports were coming in about a sniper who was cutting through their ranks, and they began to suspect it might be a woman based on some intelligence they'd gathered. This drove them absolutely insane. The Nazi ideology couldn't handle the idea that a woman was out-soldiering their men. It contradicted everything they believed about racial and gender superiority. So they started actively hunting for her, dedicating counter-sniper teams specifically to finding and killing whoever this shooter was. Ludmila knew she was being hunted. She could feel it in the way the enemy started moving, the way they'd send out scouts and counter-snipers into areas where she'd been active. It became a deadly game of chess played with real lives and real bullets. She had to constantly change positions, never use the same hide twice, and stay one step ahead of people who were now as skilled at killing as she was. And here's the thing that tells you everything about her psychology instead of making her more cautious. It made her more aggressive. She started taking calculated risks, drawing out enemy snipers so she could eliminate them. During the siege of Odessa, she killed 36 enemy snipers, not regular soldiers, snipers, people who were trained specifically to do what she did. That's like a chess grandmaster playing 36 other grandmasters and winning every single time. When Odessa fell in October 1941, Ludmila was evacuated by ship to another hellhole, Sevastopol. If Odessa was bad, Sevastopol was worse. Way worse. The Germans were obsessed with taking the city because it was the main base for the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, and they threw everything they had at it. The siege lasted 250 days. That's 8 months of continuous combat, and it is considered one of the bloodiest sieges in human history. Somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people died fighting over this one city. Let that sink in. That's more than the entire population of some major cities, all dead in less than a year of fighting. Ludmila arrived in Sevastopol in November 1941, and she would fight there until June 1942. 7 months of the most intense combat imaginable. The Germans weren't just using regular infantry and artillery. They brought in their massive railway guns, the kind that fired shells the size of cars. They bombed the city around the clock. They used flamethrowers, poison gas, everything they could think of to break the Soviet defenders. And somehow, in the middle of this apocalyptic scenario, Ludmila continued doing her job. Her daily routine during Sevastopol was something out of a nightmare. She'd wake up before dawn, often after only 2 or 3 hours of sleep, in whatever hole or ruined building she was using for shelter. She'd eat whatever rations were available, usually just bread and maybe some canned food if they were lucky. Then she'd make her way to a firing position, sometimes crawling through rubble and debris for hours to reach a good vantage point. She'd set up, camouflage herself, and then just wait. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day, waiting for targets to appear. The psychological warfare was intense. The Germans knew there was a highly effective sniper operating in the Soviet lines, and they were desperate to take her out. They'd use loudspeakers to broadcast propaganda, specifically targeting her. They offered rewards for her capture. There are accounts of them offering chocolates, money, even an officer commission if she'd defect. When that didn't work, they tried threats, broadcasting that they'd hunt her down and make an example of her. Ludmila's response: she kept shooting. One story from Sevastopol really shows you what she was dealing with. A German loudspeaker started broadcasting directly at her position, trying to intimidate her with threats about what they'd do when they captured her. Ludmila waited until she located the soldier operating the loudspeaker, calculated the distance and wind, and shot him through the speaker. The broadcasts stopped. That's ice-cold battlefield psychology right there. But it wasn't all just long-range shooting. Sevastopol was often close-quarters combat, and Ludmila had to adapt. She got into firefights at ranges where her sniper rifle wasn't ideal. She learned to fight with grenades with her sidearm, even with improvised weapons when necessary. She was wounded 4 times during the siege: shrapnel, bullet grazes, blast concussions. Each time, she patched herself up and went back to fighting. Medical evacuation wasn't really an option because leaving the line meant someone else had to take her position, and most soldiers weren't trained snipers. By June 1942, after 7 months of continuous combat in Sevastopol, Ludmila's confirmed kill count had reached 309. Think about what that means. She'd added 122 confirmed kills to her already incredible record from Odessa. That's averaging almost 1 kill per day, every single day, for 7 months. While being actively hunted, while under constant bombardment, while wounded multiple times, the level of mental and physical endurance required to do that is almost impossible to comprehend. Then came the injury that ended her combat career. In June 1942, during one of the massive German offensives, a mortar round exploded near her position. The blast threw her against a wall and peppered her with shrapnel. This time, the wounds were serious enough that she couldn't just shake them off. She was bleeding heavily, disoriented from the concussion, and her hearing was damaged. For the first time in nearly a year of combat, Ludmila Pavlichenko was pulled off the front line. The Soviet High Command made a decision that probably saved her life but ended her combat service. They evacuated her from Sevastopol on one of the last submarines to leave before the city fell. She fought them on this. She wanted to stay with her unit to keep fighting. But by this point, she wasn't just another soldier. She was becoming a propaganda asset, and the Soviet leadership realized they could use her more effectively alive as a symbol than dead as a martyr. So they pulled her out. Sevastopol fell less than a month later, and most of her unit died in the final German assault. Getting pulled from combat didn't mean Ludmila's war was over. It just changed battlefields. The Soviet Union in 1942 was in desperate shape. The Germans were deep into Soviet territory. Millions of people were dead, and Stalin needed help from the Western Allies, specifically America, which hadn't fully committed to the European war yet. So the Soviets decided to do something unprecedented. They sent Lyudmila Pavlichenko to America as part of a Soviet delegation to drum up support. Think about how wild this was. A female combat veteran from a communist country who'd personally killed more than 300 enemy soldiers, being sent to 1940s America to give speeches and meet with politicians. This was a culture clash waiting to happen, and it absolutely was. Lyudmila arrived in Washington, D.C. in August 1942, and American media lost their minds, but not in the way you'd hope. Instead of focusing on her combat record or her military achievements, American journalists were obsessed with the most superficial garbage imaginable. They asked about her uniform. Wasn't it too masculine? Why didn't she wear makeup? How did she maintain her appearance in combat? One journalist actually asked her if Soviet women were allowed to wear lipstick. Lyudmila, who'd spent the last year in actual hell fighting for her country's survival, was now dealing with reporters who wanted to know about her skincare routine. Her response to this nonsense is legendary. At one press conference, after yet another question about her appearance, she basically snapped and said something along the lines of, "I'm 25 years old. I've killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think you've been hiding behind my back for too long?" It was a direct call-out to American journalists and, by extension, to America itself for not fully engaging in the war while the Soviet Union was bleeding to death on the Eastern Front. But here's where Lyudmila showed she was as skilled with words as she was with a rifle. She started giving speeches across America, and she was brutally effective. She didn't soften her message or play nice. She talked about watching her friends die. She described what German occupation looked like. She made the war real for American audiences, who'd been reading about it in newspapers, but had UNT really confronted the horror of it, and it worked. Her tours helped shift American public opinion toward greater support for the Soviet war effort. The highlight of her American tour was meeting Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady. Unlike the journalists, Roosevelt actually took Lyudmila seriously as a soldier and a human being. The two women formed a genuine friendship. Roosevelt invited Lyudmila to stay at the White House, and they had long conversations about war, politics, and women's roles in society. This wasn't just a publicity stunt. There was real mutual respect there. Roosevelt later visited the Soviet Union in 1957, and one of the first people she asked to see was Lyudmila. After America, Lyudmila went to Canada and Britain, continuing her propaganda tour. She met with officials, gave speeches, and everywhere she went, she carried the same message. The Soviet Union was doing the bulk of the dying in this war, and the Western allies needed to step up. By the time she returned to the Soviet Union in late 1942, she'd become an international celebrity and a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country could bestow. But celebrity status couldn't erase what she'd been through. Lyudmila suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. She had nightmares. She struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had she lived when so many of her comrades died? She started drinking heavily to cope with the memories. The Soviet system wasn't great at dealing with mental health issues in combat veterans, especially female ones. They wanted her to be a symbol of Soviet strength and determination, not a traumatized young woman who couldn't sleep without reliving the siege of Sebastopol. Still, she pushed forward. She completed her university degree, earning her master's in history. She became a researcher and eventually a professor, teaching about the war she'd fought in. She wrote her memoirs and gave occasional interviews, always making sure people remembered what the war had actually been like, not the sanitized version that started emerging in popular culture. The Soviet government used her for propaganda purposes throughout the Cold War, trotting her out for state events and ceremonies. She played along because it meant she could keep telling her story and honoring the memory of those who died. But people who knew her said she was never quite the same after the war. How could she be? You don't spend a year systematically killing people, watching your friends die around you, and come out unchanged. Let's talk about something that most war documentaries gloss over, what it actually takes, psychologically, to do what Lyudmila did. Because shooting 309 people isn't like racking up points in a video game. Each one of those was a human being who woke up that morning, maybe ate breakfast, maybe thought about their family back home, and then had their life ended by a bullet they never saw coming. And Lyudmila had to live with being the person who ended all those lives. Sniping is different from other forms of combat. When you're in a regular firefight, there's chaos, adrenaline, fear pumping through your system. You're shooting at enemy positions, but often you don't even know if you hit anyone. There's a psychological distance. But sniping, you see the person. You watch them through your scope. You see their face sometimes, their mannerisms. You pick your moment, you make your calculations, and then you make a conscious, deliberate decision to end that specific person's existence. Then you watch them fall. There's no psychological distance. It's intensely personal, even though you're hundreds of meters away. Ludmila talked about this in some of her later interviews, and her honesty was remarkable. She never glorified what she did. She acknowledged that killing became easier over time, which disturbed her. The first kill made her sick. The second was slightly easier. By the time she was in Sevastopol, she could take a shot and not feel much of anything in the moment. The emotions would hit her later, usually at night when she was trying to sleep. But during combat, she'd trained herself to see the enemy not as people, but as problems to solve. Targets, threats to her comrades. If she didn't eliminate them, they'd eliminate someone on her side. That kind of mental compartmentalization is how soldiers survive psychologically in combat, but it comes at a cost. After the war, Ludmila struggled to turn it off. She'd developed this ability to detach emotionally and analytically assess threats, and that's not something you can just switch off when you come home. She had trouble with civilian life, with normal relationships, with anything that required the kind of emotional vulnerability she'd spent a year suppressing. One thing that's rarely discussed is the particular pressure on female snipers in the Soviet military. Ludmila wasn't the only one. The USSR trained and deployed about 2,000 female snipers during World War II, which was unique among the major powers. But these women faced pressure from multiple directions. They had to prove themselves to male soldiers, who often didn't believe women belonged in combat. They had to deal with enemy forces who were especially brutal if they captured a female soldier. And they had to maintain their effectiveness while dealing with all the normal challenges of being a woman, including things as basic as menstruation, while living in a frozen trench. Ludmila talked about how some male soldiers in her unit initially treated her as a liability or a distraction. She had to be better than them just to be considered equal. Every mistake she made was magnified because she was female. Every success had to be twice as impressive to get the same recognition. Eventually, she won over her unit through sheer competence. It's hard to argue with 309 confirmed kills, but that initial period was brutal. There's also the fact that the Germans specifically tried to psychologically break her. The loudspeaker broadcasts, the threats, the offers of rewards, that wasn't standard psychological warfare. That was personal. They knew she was a woman, and they tried to exploit what they assumed were feminine weaknesses. Fear, vanity, homesickness. They tried appealing to her as a mother. She had a young son back home. Wouldn't she rather be with him than dying in a trench? When none of that worked, they tried intimidation, graphically describing what they'd do if they captured her. Ludmila's response to all of this tells you everything about her mental strength. She didn't just ignore it, she used it as motivation. Every threat, every attempt at manipulation, just made her more determined. She kept a mental tally of how many counter-snipers she'd killed, almost like she was checking off German attempts to stop her. It became personal for her too, but in a way that made her more effective, not less. What's fascinating from a psychological standpoint is how she processed all of this after the war. She never claimed to be a hero in the traditional sense. She always maintained that she did what needed to be done, that any Soviet citizen would have done the same in her position. That's probably not true. Most people don't have the psychological makeup to be effective snipers. But it shows how she framed her actions to herself. She wasn't special. She wasn't a killer. She was a soldier, doing her duty. Ludmila Pavlichenko lived until 1974, dying at just 58 years old. The official cause was a stroke, but everyone who knew her said the war had taken decades off her life. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological ones never really did. She spent her post-war years teaching, researching, and occasionally appearing at state functions when the Soviet government needed a war hero for propaganda purposes. But by all accounts, she was a deeply private person who struggled with depression and alcoholism and never fully escaped the ghosts of Sevastopol. Her story raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember war heroes, especially female ones. During her lifetime, the Soviet Union used her as propaganda. Look at our strong Soviet women. Fighting alongside men, proof of communist superiority. After the Cold War ended, Western historians started paying attention to her story, but often in ways that felt exploitative. She became the badass lady sniper, reduced to a Wikipedia factoid: 309 confirmed kills. Wow, as if the number itself tells you anything meaningful about her experience. What gets lost in the celebration of her kill count is the cost. Ludmila was 24 when the war started and 26 when her combat service ended. She spent what should have been some of the best years of her life in absolute hell, killing people and watching people die. She had a son she barely got to see during those years. She had friends who died next to her. She lived with the constant knowledge that any moment could be her last. That somewhere out there was another sniper who was trying to do to her what she was doing to enemy soldiers. After the war, she tried to build a normal life. She remarried, though that marriage didn't last. She taught history at Kidu University, which had to be surreal, teaching students about wars of the past while carrying her own war inside her head. She mentored young historians and apparently was well liked by her students, though she rarely talked about her combat experience unless specifically asked. She wrote her memoirs, which were published in the Soviet Union and gave at least some insight into what she'd experienced. Though they were clearly edited to fit Soviet propaganda needs, the impact of female snipers like Ludmila on World War II is hard to quantify, but probably significant. The psychological effect on German soldiers, knowing that women were out there hunting them, was real. Nazi ideology was built on assumptions of male superiority and female weakness. And having those assumptions destroyed by people like Ludmila created genuine fear and confusion. German soldiers wrote letters home about the female snipers, often in tones of disbelief and terror. How could they maintain their belief in Aryan supremacy when they were being systematically eliminated by a Slavic woman? More broadly, Ludmila and the other Soviet female combatants challenged assumptions about women's roles in war that persist even today. The Western Allies didn't deploy women in frontline combat roles during World War II. The idea was considered absurd. Yet, here was empirical proof that women could not only survive in combat, but excel at it. That evidence was largely ignored or dismissed in the post-war years. It wasn't until decades later that Western militaries started seriously considering women for combat positions, and even then, it was controversial. Today, Ludmila Pavlichenko is remembered in various ways. In Ukraine and Russia, there are monuments and plaques honoring her. The Soviet Union issued postage stamps with her face. There have been books, documentaries, even a film made about her life. But none of these really captured the complexity of who she was. A brilliant student turned killer, a mother who left her. Child to fight a woman who became one of history's most effective snipers while struggling with what that meant for her humanity. One of her most famous quotes, translated from Russian, goes something like, "I am amazed at the kind of questions put to me by the women press correspondents in Washington. Don't they know there is a war going on? They asked me silly questions, such as, do I use powder and rouge and nail polish? And do I curl my hair? I wear my uniform with honor. It has the Order of Lenin on it. It has been covered with blood in battle." It is plain to see that with American women, what is important is whether they wear silk underwear under their uniforms. What the uniform stands for, they have yet to learn. That quote tells you everything. Ludmila Pavlichenko saw herself as a soldier first, a woman second. She did what needed to be done, paid the price for it, and spent the rest of her life trying to make people understand that war isn't glorious. Heroism isn't simple, and survival isn't the same as victory. She was 24 when she went to war, and 58 when she died. And everything in between was shaped by those 2 years she spent with a rifle in her hands,